Hi, my name is Adam Rindfleisch. I'm one of the docs at the University of Wisconsin Department of Family Medicine. I work within the Integrative Medicine group, and I'm going to be talking to you now about environmental intolerances and multiple chemical sensitivities. This is a very controversial area, and it's sometimes difficult to discuss, in part because there's so much debate about various aspects of it. Some of the main controversies include whether or not it actually is possible to class these as particular diseases. Part of the reason for that is that many groups, such as the World Health Organization, the American Academy of Allergy and Immunology, and the American Academy of Physicians, among many others, haven't formally accepted many of these illnesses as formal diagnoses. Part of the issue, too, is that these tend to be syndromes. That is, any number of things in the environment can trigger symptoms for people, and it's not really clear that those symptoms will be the same from person to person. In fact, typically, any symptom is fair game. That leads many people to say it's more of a syndrome or a group or cluster of symptoms as opposed to a particular illness per se. It also makes it very difficult to explain a particular mechanism that leads to this happening. Although we'll talk about that today, some of the theories about why environmental intolerances arise. One thing to remember with chemical sensitivities and environmental intolerances in general is that regardless of what you believe as far as their causes, their effects, their treatments, people with them are suffering, and it's absolutely important that we offer compassionate care to anyone who seeks out help with these. This care ideally should be individualized, and it should be working toward restoring function in people as much as possible. An estimated, based on some of the survey literature, probably 13% of people suffer from some kind of environmental intolerance. And this varies greatly from study to study, but an estimated 2% of people in the United States probably have some form of debilitation, including not being able to work, having to leave home, severe financial burdens because of environmental intolerances. Examples. There are a number of disorders that have been classed as environmental intolerances. Multiple chemical sensitivity is certainly the one that's been most researched. You'll see talk about sick building syndrome, Gulf War syndrome, breast implant intolerance syndrome, and toxic mold syndrome, among many others. The idea, though, is that there's something in the environment that triggers problems for people that may not necessarily affect every single person the same way. So as far as the process with environmental intolerances, one thing that seems to happen in many of them are two steps: initiation and elicitation. Initiation means that a person is exposed either in very small quantities over time or with one large exposure to a particular environmental factor, which then ultimately leads them to, in the future, have symptoms elicited by other exposures. Now, the exposures may be to completely different things. For example, a person may be exposed to paint fumes, develop some symptoms, and then later on be exposed to something like a perfume and develop symptoms that are similar to what they had with the paint exposure. Now, as far as exposures that tend to cause the most trouble, most of the data about this is out there for chemical sensitivities. The chemicals that seem to cause people issues include chemicals that come off appliances, which were reported in one study at about 87%, tobacco smoke, car exhaust, new carpeting, household cleaners, fragrances, pesticides. Any number of things can trigger this, but oftentimes odors really do seem to play a role. As far as the symptoms that are caused by these, pretty much anything is fair game, although certain symptoms do tend to be more common. The most common are headaches, burning eyes, and respiratory difficulties, but you'll see people mention GI complaints, problems with concentration, periods where people feel incredibly fatigued. Again, anything is fair game. Muscle aches is another common one. How does this come about? Theories about why environmental intolerances arise. There are a few main theories. One of the most popular theories among many people, especially those who work in environmental medicine, talks about TILT, T-I-L-T, which stands for toxin-induced loss of tolerance. The idea there is that we have a certain capacity to withstand stressors from our environments, but that if we reach a critical point, kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, then all of a sudden our bodies won't be able to tolerate exposures of any kind, and ultimately we can develop a lot of symptoms when we're exposed to various things. Another theory revolves around neurogenic inflammation, this idea that something happens to trigger the nervous system to lead to more inflammation in the body in various ways with repeated exposures. There's been a lot of work done around NMDA as a neurotransmitter in the body that may be tied to this in various ways. A third theory is that something changes in terms of the brain physiology. Certainly the parts of the brain that are related to sensation of smell, the limbic system, which is tied into emotional responses, and the system for memory are all closely linked. And what seems to happen in some functional MRI studies is that certain aspects or interconnections between these systems might actually change or become hyperactive in some way. Tied into this, it has been noted in a few small trials that people with chemical sensitivities may be more susceptible to letting molecules in through the cells or between the cells in their nasal passageways. There's also a theory that this vestigial organ that we have called the vomeronasal organ or the vomeronasal organ may actually be linked to problems as well. Another theory is the bioassociative theory. Now this ties into the idea of conditioning, and particularly conditioning a la Pavlov in his experiments with the dogs. If you remember, he gave dogs food at the same time he rang a bell and then measured how much they salivated. Then they changed it over after a while to only ring the bell and found that the dogs would still salivate because they associated the bell with the food. So the idea is you can have two things going on simultaneously that and one of them leads to a response, the other doesn't. But if they happen together enough, then a person will begin to associate both things with a particular response. In other words, exposed to a chemical, exposed to a smell, the chemical causes a symptom, but then later on the smell alone will cause the symptom too. Another theory or another correlation is that people who have environmental intolerances seem to be in very stressful situations or tend to have higher stress levels than most. So there's a question of whether the stress response may have something to do with symptoms. And another one which has been gaining a lot of currency lately in the research is whether there's a mind-body link or particularly a mental health connection. This is oftentimes something that people who suffer from these illnesses find very frustrating to work with. But the idea isn't to say simply that it's all in a person's head, but rather that there are certain points of commonality between various mental health issues and the various chemical sensitivities for whatever reason. Particularly closely linked are the somatoform disorders, the disorders where people tend to bring in physical symptoms when they're dealing with emotional or other sorts of stress. And on various personality studies and so on, what they find is that people with environmental intolerances tend to be much more likely to convert environmental stressors into physical symptoms in terms of various measures. I would note that genetic studies do indicate that the genes for people who have frequent panic attacks seem to be common with folks who have chemical sensitivities as well. As far as diagnosing chemical sensitivity, again, this is somewhat difficult because there's a lot of controversy about the nature of chemical sensitivities and other environmental illnesses as diseases, but there are some criteria out there. People will use a scale called the Keesey or Queasy scale, Q-E-E-S-I, which is available on our website if you Google DFM Integrative, just as a general survey for how the environment seems to affect a person. People will also be said to have chemical sensitivities if the problem is chronic, usually going on for months. If it's reproducible, that is, they're exposed to something and then similar exposures will lead to the same symptoms. The symptoms should go away after the exposure stops. Certainly that can take a while for some people. In addition, multiple organ systems are typically involved. That is, you may have respiratory symptoms as well as muscular symptoms. Different parts of the body can be affected by the response to a chemical or to another environmental pathogen or problem. Unfortunately, there's no specific lab test for chemical sensitivities. There are groups out there who will do various forms of lab testing, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of great research in terms of how useful that information is. As far as treatment for chemical sensitivities, certainly there are general principles that I tell folks to follow regardless of what their belief system is around these particular types of illnesses. Certainly, as I mentioned before, compassion is key. People are suffering. Do everything that's possible to help alleviate their suffering. Remembering, though, that it reaches a point where testing isn't necessarily the solution. Sometimes the solution is to focus more on function and restoration of function, keeping people able to work, keeping them able to be in their homes, enabling them to stay in their social circles and that kind of a thing. It's interesting that the average person in some surveys says that they spend over $50,000 on healthcare during their lifetimes for chemical sensitivity related issues. And it's not uncommon for people to lose their jobs, their marriages, or to need to completely move in order to deal with their symptoms. That leads into one of the main treatments for this, which is avoidance of the things that seem to cause the problems. Most of the data that I have in terms of what I recommend for treatment comes from surveys of people with the disorder who describe what's helpful for them. I wish I could say we had more research than that, but down the road, hopefully that will be the case. Working with various things such as support groups seems to help. Also prayer, faith healing, people report as being very helpful, as well as energy medicine, acupressure, exercise. Another one that people will use frequently is rotation diets, where during the course of a few-week period, people will change their diets every so often from one group of foods to another so that their body can have a time to recover from a particular food group if it's triggering some of their symptoms. As far as supplements, not a lot of research, but people have said that magnesium supplementation, if they're low, can be helpful. Some people will also talk about using something like vitamin A or vitamin C. And then milk thistle is another popular one. Many patients will talk about different forms of detoxification as well. So, in a nutshell, those are approaches to chemical sensitivity. It's pretty clear that there's a lot more we need to do to understand all of this. It's also very important, as I've said, to work with this so that people who are suffering from these kinds of issues can have compassionate, individualized, and very collaborative care as they move through it. It's a very difficult process for people, but something that can be made much easier if only providers are mindful about the issues that arise.